For KPAL and Kontakt Mission, I'm Anna Kiko, Cults and New Religion Specialist with Russia Christi. When engaging with Jehovah's Witnesses apologetically, it's crucial that the Christian apologist has an overall knowledge of both the aberrant theology they will encounter, but also a working knowledge of the overall timeline that developed the group. The reason this is so critical is because damaging cult groups like the Witnesses employ a common informational control tactic called coercive persuasion. In so doing, they purposely rewrite, reframe, and sometimes flat out remove their adherents' access to older materials that would expose theological errors, false prophecies, and even keep from new recruits the knowledge of their group's true origins. And since every Jehovah's Witness will have differing access or exposure to older material, you'll need to have a working knowledge of their major changes and developments to the group over time to be able to respond to objections accordingly. Let's begin with an overall timeline. The Jehovah's Witnesses have not always been called by that name. Their founder, Charles Taze Russell, originally called the group the Bible Student Movement. With their initial monthly magazine subscription, their material was not free in spite of what missionaries might tell you, called Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. Only a few years later, Russell would also found the Zion's Watchtower and Tract Society. And during the late 1880s, Russell would also publish a Bible study called Millennial Dawn. If any of this is sounding familiar, it's because these publications are still widely used by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Millennial Dawn became Studies in the Scriptures, and the word Zion was dropped in lieu of the shorter Watchtower Bible and Tract Society and renamed the magazine The Watchtower. After Russell came a man named J.F. Rutherford, who was responsible for most of this rebranding, as the circumstances surrounding his election as president were highly dubious, and 3/4 of the existing Bible students left as a result. Those who remained became what are known today as Jehovah's Witnesses. Governance within this group is also noteworthy, as it has evolved significantly over time. Up until the 1970s, governance, including changes to theology, belonged solely to the presiding president. After the 1970s, however, governance moved to the Witnesses' Board of Directors, called the governing body. And it's this group of men that determine which teachings to adapt, to change, or drop completely, and it's this group to whom they claim God speaks directly with new revelation. For example, prior to 1980, it was determined that for the Jehovah's Witnesses to partake in an organ transplant surgery would be tantamount to cannibalism. But after countless witnesses had died from lack of medical care, the governing body reversed its stance on organ transplants. This reversal extended even to bone marrow transplants, a very telling development considering they've never permitted blood transfusions in general. Changes, specific developments, reversals in dogma, as well as the numerous false prophecies made regularly in this circle are explained with the phrase, "the light is getting brighter," which is intended to mean that Jehovah is not misleading his people through this direct revelation, but is rather the governing body being too quick or careless with the messages they're receiving. With this very rapid overview of this group's history, you now have a framework by which to understand their theology and to begin committing their aberrant teachings to memory for evangelism purposes. First and foremost, you must understand that the Jehovah's Witnesses teach a form of Arianism. This is the belief that Jesus Christ is a created being and not a member of the Godhead. For the Witnesses, the Trinity is considered a pagan import and a mishandling of the Scriptures. They justify this position with a highly altered and edited Bible called the New World Translation, produced by then-President Nathan Knorr in 1960. Knorr spent several years systematically removing any and all references to Jesus' divinity and the Trinity in order for the new Bible students to never be exposed to the Scriptures authentically and to better control the flow of information amongst adherents who were seriously studying the Scriptures on their own. To make matters worse, since the Witnesses believe that the governing body is God's only prophet on earth, each witness is required to reverse their personal theology when the governing body directs them to, which means, as an evangelist, you'll have to keep up, or else you might be going in circles. Some things have not changed, however, and due to their oddity can be effective to focus on when encountering a witness coming to knock on your door. For instance, not only is Jesus Christ a created being, but he's also Michael the Archangel, who came to earth invisibly in the year 1914 to begin his earthly millennial reign. So too the Holy Spirit is not a member of the Godhead, nor is he a person, but rather is what's called an active force, meaning that you should consider the Holy Spirit along the same lines as you might think of physical forces like gravity or artificial forces like radar. Salvation requirements include belonging to the organization as well as obedience to the organizational rules. On top of this, Jehovah's Witnesses believe in two categories of believer: those who belong to the anointed class and get to enter heaven, and those who are non-anointed Jehovah's Witnesses who will not be able to enter heaven but will instead stay on earth after it's recreated. Of the anointed class of believers, there are only 144,000. Any person that does not belong to either of these classes will enter hell, which they believe is not a real place, but is rather the state of having been annihilated upon death. This belief is predicated on their denial of an immortal soul. According to the witnesses, all humans are annihilated when they die, and only those who belong to the Jehovah's Witnesses will be remade by God in the new heavens and the new earth. So as you can see from this material, you have ample directions you can go in as an evangelist. Having spent years doing this kind of work myself, allow me to close with some helpful pointers to get you started. Jehovah's Witnesses use an ask and answer structure in order to train their publishers. Publishers are the folks who you're almost undoubtedly encountering when you're out and about evangelizing. What this method does psychologically is provide the witnesses with a new identity by which they view the world that does not permit them to think for themselves or question the material being memorized. And this means that they're effectively talking to you from behind a script they have practiced during theocratic ministry school. That's the mandatory weekly training they go to. Knowing this, you then have the key to providing them an environment that they are never permitted in, an environment where they're authentically allowed to think for themselves. Your goal as an evangelist to the Jehovah's Witnesses should constantly revolve around getting them off script. They will press back and try to take control of the interaction or the book study they may have invited you to join, and that's all right. Stay kind and patient and continue to guide the witnesses off of the pre-programmed conversation and into something new. For instance, when they say to you, "I would like to read to you from the scriptures," instead of staying silent, use some of the material you've learned in this video and say, "Well, sure, let's use my Bible. I'm not a fan of Nathan Knorr's altered texts. Let's use a translation that the Jehovah's Witnesses used prior to 1960. I guarantee that unless you're dealing with an elderly Jehovah's Witness, that the look of confusion that will erupt on their face will be precisely the intellectual climate you will need to talk to the real person behind the false identity and get them off script long enough to be effective. The point is that you want to be creative. Ask questions, use the interaction as an information gathering pursuit, and let the Jehovah's Witnesses realize through their having to think on their own, outside of the governing body's contradictory positions, that perhaps they have some of the same questions for their elders that you have for them. Make certain to avoid an attitude of confrontational condescension. Besides it being not very Christ-centered, any attempts to malign this cult to the victim in front of you will end up feeding their belief that the faithful and discreet slave, that's what the governing body refers to itself as, is true. And that's because the Jehovah's Witnesses regularly inspire in their victims a sort of persecution complex, meaning they prime their publishers with the knowledge that many folks who they will encounter will try to call them a cult or malign them in some way. Then when they get to you and you fulfill this expectation, you end up feeding the feeling in the witnesses in front of you that their organization is telling the truth. Last, but certainly not least, above all, pray. There is no one-size-fits-all type of formula for evangelizing to the Jehovah's Witnesses. This means that it's critical that you are seeking the discernment of the Spirit in real time while engaging them. Practice silently beseeching the Spirit to intervene in the mind of the witness in front of you while you are engaging them. It takes a bit of mental gymnastics in that level of multitasking, but with time it'll get easier. And believe me, it's well worth it. For KPAL and Kontakt Mission, I'm Anna Kitko, Cults and New Religion Specialist with Ratio Christi.